Part 3 Mozart's Break with Salzburg Mozart had reason to suppose that the work might gain him a permanent and rewarding position. Once more he was disappointed, and a short time after the production he received a summons from Salzburg to join the Archbishop in Vienna, whither Colloredo had gone with a part of his musical staff. Leopold, it should be added, was left at home. Wolfgang boiled inwardly at the prospect of having the honor once more of sitting above the cooks at table. His father begged him to be patient, but to no avail. In a way he welcomed the present call to Vienna and seemed to sense his impending liberation, if without knowing exactly how it was to come. "It seems as if good fortune is about to welcome me here," he wrote his parent not long afterwards from the capital, "and now I feel that I must stay. Indeed, I felt when I left Munich that, without knowing why, I looked forward most eagerly to Vienna." He was seeking an opportunity to break forever with his detested chief, to whom he alluded as an Erzlümmel (arch-booby). He soon found his chance. The Archbishop at first refused Mozart permission to appear at the Tonkünstler Sozietät, about which he wrathfully wrote to his father, yet a postscript added that in the end he got it. That his place at table was between the valets and the cooks is, Alfred Einstein says, rightly shocking both to the composer and to us. But Mozart's rank as court organist was actually that of personal servant, and according to 18th century etiquette, which knew nothing of special treatment for genius, this seating at table was formally correct. In the end, the threatened explosion did occur. Colloredo ordered him back to Salzburg on a certain day. Alleging some important engagement in Vienna, he refused, and when the Archbishop told him he could go to the devil, he applied for his dismissal from the cleric's service. 3 times he presented applications. Finally, when he made an effort to enter Colloredo's apartment to hand him the paper personally, Count Arco, son of the court chamberlain, kicked him out of the room. But Mozart did get the discharge he had demanded. The tale of the kick is familiar even to people who have not the vaguest familiarity with 18th century codes. We might be well advised, however, to suspend our judgment till we know both sides of the celebrated story. "No more Salzburg for me," Wolfgang gaily wrote his father. Barring repeated journeys to different cities, Vienna was to be his home for the rest of his days. He was not to find the material rewards and the secure position he had sought for so long, but he had that freedom his spirit craved. And in Vienna he was to absorb those creative impulses that Haydn had known before him, and Beethoven was to know after him. In a mood of elation he begged his father to leave Salzburg and join him in Vienna. But Leopold was no longer young, and besides he was made of other clay. Marriage. Mozart renewed his ties with the Webers once more. Aloysia, indeed, was now out of his reach, but there were 3 other daughters, the youngest still a child, to be sure. The oldest, Josepha, had a good voice, but she left Wolfgang cold. He was more attracted to Aloysia's sister, Constanze, a fact that was not lost on the scheming Mother Weber, now a widow, content to rent rooms and take in boarders. In May 1781 he settled in the Weber house, zum Auge Gottes, just off the Graben. Needless to say, Leopold was greatly upset, for he had as low an opinion of the Webers as ever. But Wolfgang was no longer disposed to let his father's taste sway him, and when he felt that he really loved Constanze, he determined to make her his wife, regardless of parental wishes. The unscrupulous Madame Weber, pleased at the turn of affairs, took care that gossip should spread and people began to talk about the probability of the marriage. Mozart, yielding to Mother Weber's advice, left the Auge Gottes in September 1781, though returning for daily visits. Constanze's mother played her cards cleverly so as to compromise her daughter, and enjoyed the satisfaction of having Mozart ask his father for his approval. A Weber for a daughter-in-law was the last thing Leopold wanted. Finally, on August 4, 1782, the couple married, the elder Mozart's reluctant consent not arriving in Vienna until August 5. He never forgave his son, however, for this step. No more did Nannerl, who had quite as little use for her brother's wife. Later, after the composer's death, Schlichtegrull's necrology said of Constanze, Mozart found in her a good mother for the 2 children she bore him, who sought to restrain him from many follies and dissipations. The rest of which passage Constanze was subsequently moved to make illegible. Be all of which as it may, there is no use in pretending that Mozart was, earlier or later, in the least indifferent to feminine allurements. Sometimes it was the women who plagued him with attentions, a capital instance of which was his pupil, the pianist Josephine Arnhammer, a talented but exceedingly repulsive person, of whom he left us a gruesome picture in a letter dated August 22, 1781. "She is as fat as a farm wench, perspires so that you feel inclined to vomit, and goes about so scantily clad that you really can read as plain as print. Pray do look here." It was for this same Arnhammer, none the less, that he wrote the adorable Clavier Concerto, K. 453. Alfred Einstein maintains that Constanze owes her fame to the fact that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart loved her, and in so doing preserved her name for eternity, as a fly is preserved in amber. But this does not mean that she deserved either his love or the fame it brought her. Certainly she could not follow his flights of genius. Neither was she always above reproach in her private conduct. Before their marriage her honest and devoted lover was writing to point out her thoughtless behavior in allowing some man to measure her leg in a game of forfeits, and nearly a decade later he was begging her to "consider appearances," to be careful of her honor, and to keep away from the Baden Casino because "the company is—you understand what I mean." Einstein believed that the only woman of whom Constanze had a right to be jealous was Nancy Storace, his first Susanna. Between Mozart and her there must have been a deep and sympathetic understanding. She was beautiful, an artist, and a finished singer. Die Entführung aus dem Serail. The composer was probably delighted to have the chance to place on the stage a character named Constanze, and in the summer and autumn of 1781 he began the music of his next major opera, Belmont und Constanze, or Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Abduction from the Seraglio. This Singspiel, the book of which was originally the work of Christian Friedrich Bretzner, had been presented a year earlier in Germany with a score by Johann André. Under Wolfgang's careful supervision, the 3-act piece underwent dramatic and textual modifications by Christian Gottlob Stephani the Younger. Mozart had written his father, "The book is good, the subject is Turkish and is called The Abduction from the Seraglio." Rehearsals did not start till June 1782, and on July 16 of that year the work was produced in Vienna with extraordinary success. The stimulus back of Stephani's revisions was unquestionably the penetrating theater sense of the composer himself. Into the love songs of the tenor, Belmonte, Mozart poured all his tender feelings for Constanze Weber, whom he was shortly to lead to the altar. The characterizations throughout have a life, a diversity, and a psychological truth that had not been met with in any previous Mozartian operatic effort. The Emperor, though he recognized the genius in the work, thought it necessary to warn Mozart that the music seemed to him too good for the Viennese and contained "a powerful quantity of notes," whereupon the ready-witted Mozart retorted, "Just as many as are necessary, Your Majesty." His older contemporary, Gluck, was himself stirred to enthusiasm by the work, in which he unquestionably detected the influence of his own exotic Les Pèlerins de la Mecque, and invited the composer to dinner. Die Entführung, which Carl Maria von Weber was to say was such a work as Mozart could have written only once in his lifetime, quickly spread through most other theaters of Central Europe, where, after close to 200 years, it still leads a lusty existence. The more amusing, therefore, is a notice the disgruntled Bretzner inserted in a Leipzig newspaper: "A certain person in Vienna named Mozart has had the effrontery to misuse my drama Belmonte und Constanze for an opera libretto. I herewith protest most solemnly that I reserve the right to take further steps against this outrage." On the surface the newly married couple were happy, yet it might be inquiring too closely to ask whether Wolfgang did not, as time passed, suffer from that deep-seated loneliness and lack of understanding that are sooner or later the lot of a genius of this caliber. Under today's conditions we have reason to assume that a triumph like Die Entführung and the numberless other treasures he was giving the world would lift him above material cares. Instead, financial troubles began to thicken about him and grew continually more burdensome. They were indeed to beset him to his end. For all the air it created, the opera did not bring its composer the appointment he expected, and money was becoming a pressing necessity. Constanze's pregnancies were frequent during her married life, and though only 2 children survived infancy, to become, it is ironic to reflect, wretched but fairly long-lived mediocrities, her various confinements and her slow recovery from them did not help to further her housewifely qualities. It is not wholly surprising that Mozart's religious convictions, which had earlier been a sort of childlike faith, weakened little by little, the more so because he was brought into growing contact with men who were profound thinkers and of whom many belonged to the secret society of Freemasons. Freemasonry had political implications and was frowned upon by the Church. Frederick the Great had been a Freemason, Goethe was one, likewise Joseph II, Gluck, and Joseph Haydn. Eventually Mozart persuaded his father to join the society. Who shall say that its principles and philosophies did not serve Wolfgang as a protective armor, enabling him the more bravely to endure his social and material tribulations? Pupils and friends. Haydn. Mozart took his wife to Salzburg in the summer of 1783. He had made a vow the previous year that when he married Constanze and presented her to his father he would bring along a newly composed mass for presentation in his native town. The superb one in C minor was the outcome, but for some reason it remained unfinished. We cannot speculate here on the reason for its incompleteness. The torso, or shall we say patchwork, was rehearsed in St. Peter's Church in Salzburg, and Constanze sang some of the soprano solos. Despite its incompleteness, the C minor Mass is a soaring masterwork, the music of which Mozart later put to use in the oratorio Davide Penitente. The relentless dislike of the Webers that both Leopold and Nannerl continued to harbor was not mollified by this visit, which proved uncomfortable as long as it lasted. Wolfgang and his wife were relieved when the troublesome duty call came to its chilly end and they were back in Vienna once more. There was no end of professional business for Mozart to transact, composition in flooding abundance, lessons to give, concerts, academies to organize, musical personages to cultivate. Just now, at least, there were no interminable travels such as had filled Mozart's boyhood years. His pupils were sometimes talented, sometimes the reverse. A few striking names stand out among them: Johann Nepomuk Hummel, Xaver Süssmayr, Thomas Attwood. Of the composers and executants with whom he came in contact, we must mention Clemente, Salieri, Paisiello, Regini, Haydn. With Clemente he appeared as a pianist in a contest before Joseph II and some visiting Russian blue bloods. So evenly were the two players matched that the competition was declared a draw. Paisiello, composer of The Barber of Seville, was a lovable character for whom Wolfgang developed a great liking. Salieri, a disciple of Gluck and a teacher of Schubert, appears to have criticized some of Mozart's works, and Viennese gossip did what it could to make the matter worse. The result was that Salieri lives on in history largely because of a wild slander that he had given Mozart a poison, causing the latter's untimely death. The meeting with Joseph Haydn resulted in one of the noblest and most rewarding friendships the records of music afford. Artistically, their creations benefited inestimably from the mutual influence of their works and personalities. Haydn, says Dr. Karl Geiringer, was fascinated by Mozart's quicksilver personality, while Mozart enjoyed the sense of security that Haydn's steadfastness and warmth of feeling gave him. It was as if the two men kindled brighter sparks in each other's souls. They played chamber music together whenever Haydn made a trip to Vienna, and the younger man was quick to acknowledge that it was from his older colleague he first really learned to write string quartets. The six that he composed between 1782 and 1785, and dedicated with moving words to his beloved friend Haydn, are doubtless among the finest he wrote. It was on a visit of Leopold Mozart's to Vienna that Haydn made to him the oft-quoted remark, "I tell you before God and as an honest man that your son is the greatest composer known to me either in person or by reputation." And later, when someone questioned a detail in Don Giovanni and asked Haydn's opinion, he replied, "I cannot settle this dispute, but this I know: Mozart is the greatest composer that the world now possesses. It enrages me to think that the unparalleled Mozart has not yet been engaged by some imperial or royal court. Do forgive this outburst, but I love the man too much." It is heartbreaking that Haydn was not able, as he would have loved to be, to secure a post for Mozart in England. Mozart had another encounter of a different sort at this period in Vienna, acquaintance with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Through the Baron von Swieten he had opportunity to know the scores of Bach and Handel, and later even to write for certain Handel oratorios additional accompaniments for use in performances von Swieten was in the habit of giving on Sundays at the Imperial Library and in some private homes. And the depth, the grandeur, and the polyphony of these masters he assimilated to the added greatness of his own mature works. Hofner Symphony. With his concerts, teaching, clavier playing, and miscellaneous composing, Mozart may well have felt, as he remarked on one occasion, that people sometimes expected impossibilities of me. The Hofner family in Salzburg, for instance, asked Leopold to write a symphony for some family festivity, to be ready in something like a fortnight. Wolfgang, at that time up to his ears in a quantity of other schemes, found the labor shifted to his own shoulders by his father, who was otherwise busied. Somehow or other he contrived to turn out, in a trifle over the appointed time, it is true, the work we now know as the Hofner Symphony. The excellent Salzburg burgomaster, Siegmund Hofner, appears to have been well pleased. The composer himself instantly forgot the work and was astonished and delighted when, a considerable time afterwards, his father sent him the score. He worked at several operatic projects, but nothing lasting came of them, not even of The Goose of Cairo, which contains charming passages, and which now and then people have attempted to revive. There was indeed an amateur performance in Vienna of Idomeneo, but these and several other schemes must all be dismissed as transient compared with the masterpiece we now approach, Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro. Le Nozze di Figaro. Mozart had longed for years to write a German opera. He boasted of himself as a thoroughly patriotic German and longed for the day when we should dare to feel as Germans and even, if I may say so, to sing in German. The nearest he had come to composing a German Singspiel was when as a child he had produced his little song play Bestien und Bestienne, and again when in 1782 he turned out the inimitable Die Entführung aus dem Serail. But his ambitions soared even higher, and he consumed no end of time and energy perusing the countless opera books sent to him without finding anything that suited his true artistic and dramatic purposes. For a while he had dreamed of accomplishing something in his Mannheim days, even listening with interest, but nothing more, to stuff like Holzbauer's Gunther von Schwarzburg. Though he briefly thought of a Rudolf von Habsburg, he had no choice, in the end, but to return to Italian models, now, however, with a difference. Soon after the amateur presentation of Idomeneo in Vienna, he had the good fortune to be brought together with Lorenzo da Ponte, whose real name was Emanuele Conegliano, and who belonged to a Jewish family in Coneda, near Venice. The youth entered a theological seminary and became an industrious student with a poetic bent, which resulted in quantities of Italian and Latin verse. An outspoken adventurer with countless amorous escapades a la Casanova to his credit, he began his theatrical career in Dresden, went to Vienna, where he was to enjoy the favor of Joseph II, and in the process of time went to London and finally to America, where he became a teacher of languages, a liquor merchant, a theater enthusiast, and what not. He died in New York many years after Mozart, but like him was buried in a grave of which all traces have been lost. Mozart suggested to his picturesque collaborator, who cheerfully wrote opera books for Salieri, Martin, Rignini, and others, a libretto to be adapted from Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais' Les Noces de Figaro, of which Paisiello had recently composed Beaumarchais' predecessor, Le Barbier de Seville. But Figaro had been prohibited in France because it reflected on the morals of the aristocracy, and the same ban had been in effect in Vienna. Da Ponte, altering it for Mozart's purposes, adroitly eliminated its barbed satire, and then, tactfully explaining his alterations to the emperor, secured his permission for the performance. The composer, who limited his teaching to the afternoon in order to complete the score, had been as touchy as gunpowder and threatened to burn the opera if it were not produced by a certain time. To Joseph II's credit it must be said that the music delighted him as soon as Mozart played him a few samples. Figaro was produced at the Burgtheater on May 1, 1786. A lucky star shone on its birth in spite of intrigues set in motion against it. Its success was tremendous and was abundantly foreshadowed during the rehearsals. The Irish tenor Michael Kelly, Italianized as Ocelli, left us in his memoirs a striking account of the delight with which the singers and orchestra joined the listeners at the end of the first act in acclaiming the composer. "I shall never forget," he says, "his little animated countenance when lighted up with the glowing rays of genius. It is as impossible to describe as it would be to paint sunbeams." Father Mozart wrote to Nannerl that not only had almost every number to be repeated, but that at the following performances 5 were encored, the letter duet having to be sung 3 times. In the end the emperor forbade repetitions. That season Figaro received 9 hearings, and for the 2 following years not a single one. Mozart's opponents, after a momentary check, had conspired successfully once more. Prague. Luckily, the incorrigibly musical Czechs championed Mozart to the limit. With Die Entführung he had won them heart and soul, and by the time Figaro reached Prague, that city was on the way to becoming the true Mozart capital of Europe. From that moment nothing seemed greatly to matter but that opera. In the composer's own words, people would listen to nothing else and talk of nothing else. Its melodies were worked up into dance arrangements. Players in beer gardens and even the wandering street musicians who begged for pennies on corners had to sing or strum their Non puis André and the rest of the tunes if they wanted any passer-by to pay attention to them. Truly a great honor for me, mused the composer. Prague, now a high altar of Mozart worship, was for some time to remain so. The creator of Figaro had valued friends in Prague. Among the dearest of these were the Duscheks, whom he had known in Salzburg, Franz, a gifted pianist and composer, and his wife Josepha, both older than Mozart. Josepha, an excellent musician, became an exceptional singer, and for her Wolfgang was to compose some superb, though difficult, concert arias. She was well-to-do, and with the money an admirer lavished on her, she bought herself an estate known as the Bert Gromke, still one of the show places of Prague, despite the vicissitudes of more than a century and a half. Here Mozart was often an honored guest, and to this day the villa and the hilly gardens surrounding it seem to breathe his spirit. The permanent Italian company that supplied opera to the people of Prague, though not large, was exceedingly capable. At this time it was managed by a certain Pasquale Bondini. Its two efficient conductors, both of them Bohemians, Joseph Strobach and J.B. Kuchart, were heart and soul devoted to Mozart. The intensely music-loving Czechs jammed Mozart's academies and could not hear enough of his symphonies and clavier works. Small wonder, therefore, that Bondini resolved to take advantage of the heaven-sent opportunity of Mozart's presence to commission him to write a new opera for the company's next season. The fee was the usual sum of 100 ducats, no more, the opera Don Giovanni. Actually, much more could be said of this Prague visit of Mozart's. At one of his concerts he presented for the first time the D major Symphony, which sent its hearers into such raptures that the world has forever named it the Prague Symphony. When he arrived from Vienna it had been arranged that he was to stay with the Duscheks, but Josepha being away, Mozart accepted the hospitality of the aristocrat Count Thun, and sat as an honored guest among the great of the land. He doubtless remembered how at Colloredo's court his table companions had been cooks and grooms. He was taken to the sumptuous dwelling of still another local patrician, the Count Canal, and so it continued from day to day. Yet he found time to write a piece for a wandering harpist, which the latter played everywhere, boasting that Mozart had specially composed it for him. End of Part 3. Part 4. Death of Leopold Mozart. In February 1787, Mozart was back in Vienna in a joyous frame of mind. One may question that this jubilant mood was of long duration. That the new opera was to be ready as early as the following October was hardly the greatest of his worries, for Mozart, like Haydn, Bach, and other masters of that century, was accustomed to a speed of creative production that puts our machine age to shame. The welcome the Viennese accorded the returning traveler, flushed by the recollection of his recent triumphs, was frosty. Also, there came the news that his father's health was failing. Naturally, reflected Leopold, old people do not grow younger. Wolfgang wrote his parents in words that nobly convey the essence of his own mature philosophy. I need not tell you with what anxiety I await better news from you, although I am wont in all things to anticipate the worst. Since death is the true goal of our lives, I have made myself so well acquainted during the past 2 years with this true and best friend of mankind that the idea of it no longer holds any terror for me, but rather much that is tranquil and comforting. And I thank God that He has granted me the good fortune to obtain this opportunity of regarding death as the key to our true happiness. I never lie down in bed without considering that, young as I am, perhaps I may on the morrow be no more. Yet not one of those who know me say that I am morose or melancholy, and for this I thank my Creator and wish heartily that the same happiness may be given to my fellow men. One is moved to think of Schubert's words to his father a few years later, when looking upon the lakes and peaks of the Austrian Alps he wrote, "As if death were the worst thing that could befall one, could one but look on these divine lakes and mountains, he would deem it a great happiness to be restored for a new life to the inscrutable forces of the earth." All the same, Mozart was profoundly shaken when, on May 28, his father passed away without the opportunity to see his son once more. "You can realize my feelings," he wrote his friend Gottfried von Jachin. we shall not go far wrong when we surmise that these deep and solemn emotions colored to a considerable degree some of the more tragic pages of the nascent Don Giovanni, the book of which Da Ponte was now writing for him while working at the same time on librettos for Salieri and Martin. In the spring of 1787 the composer had a brief but memorable encounter. For at this time there came briefly to Vienna from Bonn a 16-year-old youth, Ludwig van Beethoven, a protégé of the Count Waldstein, presumably to study with Mozart. The latter heard his visitor improvise and was at first unimpressed because he believed the extemporization had been memorized, but was converted as soon as he gave the young Rhinelander a complicated theme to treat on the spot. The originality and seriousness of what he heard stirred the older musician to the prophecy, "This young man is going to make the world talk about him." But Mozart had, at the moment, no leisure for this prospective pupil, who returned shortly to Bonn, and on his later trip after Mozart's death placed himself under the direction of Haydn. Don Giovanni. In mid-September Mozart and Constanze went to Prague, bringing the partly finished Don Giovanni score. Bondini had found the composer lodging at the house on the Kohlmarkt called the Three Lion Cubs. Across the way at the inn Zum Platteis rooms were engaged for Da Ponte, and as the windows faced each other, composer and librettist had long discussions across the narrow street about details of the book, in the preparation of which Mozart, with his keen dramatic instincts, played a dominating role. He and Constanze appeared, however, to have spent quite as much time with the Dutschkes at the Bertranka as at the Three Lion Cubs. Rehearsals consumed a great amount of energy. There were numerous modifications to be made in the music. The young baritone Luigi Bassi, who had the title role, demanded 5 recastings of the duet La Sidarum before he was satisfied with the music. And Mozart had all manner of trouble with Caterina Micelli, the Elvira. In addition, the singer of Zerlina, Caterina Bondini, could not utter the peasant girl's shriek in the first finale to the composer's satisfaction, until he terrified her by grasping her roughly and thus causing her to scream exactly as he wanted. After one of the last rehearsals, the conductor Kucharz, being asked by the master for his candid opinion of the opera, replied encouragingly, "Whatever comes from Mozart will always delight in Bohemia." "I assure you, dear friend, I have spared myself no pains to produce something worthy for the people of Prague," declared the composer, who had already boasted that "my Praguers understand me." Here is the place, no doubt, to tell once more the oft-repeated tale of the overture, put on paper, according to a hoary legend, the night before the premiere, while Constanze kept the master awake by plying him with punch and telling him stories. As a matter of fact, the overture was written the night before the dress rehearsal, and it was nothing unusual for Mozart to write down at the last moment a work mentally finished in every detail. A few days after the first performance, the Prague Oberpostamtszeitung published a review that probably excels anything ever written about the opera. It read simply, "Connoisseurs and musicians say that nothing like it has ever been produced in Prague." The opinion is probably as true today as in 1787, for there is literally nothing like Don Giovanni, either among its composer's creations or elsewhere. One can only share the emotion of Rossini when, being shown the manuscript score, he said to its owner, the singer Pauline Viardot Garcia, "I want to bow the knee before this sacred relic," and echo the words of Richard Wagner, "What is more perfect than every number in Don Giovanni?" Where else has music won so infinitely rich an individuality, been able to characterize so surely, so definitely, and in such exuberant plenitude as here? Figaro is, if you will, the more perfect artistic entity of the two. Don Giovanni is looser, less consistent, on the surface even grossly illogical. But so, too, is human nature. And if all the world's a stage, what more than a dramma giocoso is the experience of life? Whatever the narrow intent of Lorenzo da Ponte when he carpentered the book out of well-worn odds and ends, it was with a profound knowledge of the sorrows and absurdities of humankind that Mozart breathed into it an abiding soul. "Long live da Ponte, long live Mozart," had written the stage director Domenico Guardasone. "All impresarios, all artists must exalt them to the skies, for as long as such men live there can be no more question of theater miseries." The Duscheks outdid themselves to make life pleasant for their guests. Mozart found time to compose several songs and even a superb concert air, Bella mia fiamma addio, for Josepha, after that lady had locked him up in the garden house till he had finished the promised music. On November 15, 1787, which virtually coincided with the composer's return to Vienna, Gluck died. Less than a month later, Joseph II appointed Mozart to the older master's post of Kammerkompositeur, with an annual salary of 800 Gulden. Gluck had received 2,000, and before long Mozart was complaining that his pay was too much for what he did, too little for what he could do. What he did was principally to supply minuets, contradances, and Teutsche for court balls and similar occasions. The year 1788 dawned in gloomy fashion for Mozart. To be sure, Don Giovanni had its first Viennese hearing on May 7, with a cast including his sister-in-law, Aloysia Lange, as Donna Anna, Caterina Cavalieri, the original Costanza in the Entführung, as Elvira, and Francesco Benucci, the first Figaro, as Leporello. Mozart had cut out some numbers, replacing them with new ones, eliminating the platitudinous epilogue, and ended the work with the prodigious hell music of Don Giovanni's disappearance. The Emperor remarked, "The opera is divine, perhaps even finer than Figaro, but it is a rather tough morsel for the teeth of my Viennese," to which Mozart replied, "Let us give them time to chew it." Symphonies in E-flat, G minor, and C major. Yet from now on he was to pay for his Prague triumphs. With a kind of fateful persistence things seemed to go wrong. That an infant daughter died was a rather familiar affliction. Of the children of the Mozart couple only the sons, Karl and Raymond Leopold, survived infancy. Money troubles plagued him unremittingly. Again and again he had to appeal for loans to Michael Puchberg, a merchant and brother Mason, and later to Franz Hofdemel, a jurist of his acquaintance whose wife was one of his pupils. But by and large these pupils were becoming scarcer, and there seemed steadily less patronage for the academies he planned. To make matters worse, Costanza's management of the household appeared to go from bad to worse. The arrangements of works like Handel's Acis and Galathea and Messiah, which he was making about this time for the parsimonious Baron von Swieten, brought in as good as nothing. Mozart's affairs were falling into a sordid, not to say tragic, state. Small wonder, therefore, that he grasped at the opportunity to settle outside of Vienna proper in a house in the Währing district, where the air was purer than in the heart of the city and where he had the added advantages of quiet and a garden. A change of residence had never been a particular hardship for the Mozarts. In the space of 9 years they moved 11 times in Vienna alone. Their life, says Alfred Einstein, was like a perpetual tour, changing from one hotel room to another. In one of the handsomer dwellings, Schullergasse 8, the ceiling of Mozart's workroom had fine plaster ornamentation with sprites and cherubs. I am convinced that Mozart never wasted a glance on it. He was ready at any instant to exchange Vienna for another city or Austria for another country. He was thinking of a trip to Russia as a result of conversations with the Russian ambassador in Dresden in 1789. But he had to be satisfied with smaller journeys, and with journeys within Vienna. In his varying surroundings, however, he boasted of being able to accomplish more work in a few days than elsewhere in a month. The finest fruit of this suburban sojourn is the glorious symphonic trilogy, the masterpieces in E flat, G minor, and C major, composed in June, July, and August, respectively. The third, the sublime Jupiter, the last of Mozart's 41 symphonies, and given its deathless name no one knows exactly by whom or why. The three, which have a profound psychological connection, were written, in all probability, for a series of academies that never took place. However this may be, they are the crown of Mozart's symphonic compositions and rank indisputably as the greatest symphonies before Beethoven. Così fan tutti. In April 1789, a ray of hope suddenly appeared to illuminate his depressing horizon. A friend and pupil, the young Prince Karl Lichnowsky, who had estates in Silesia and an important rank in the Prussian army, invited Mozart to accompany him on a trip to Berlin. Lichnowsky enjoyed influence at the court of the music-loving Prussian king, Frederick William II, and seemed ready to recommend his teacher to the good graces of the monarch. At last Mozart had reason to anticipate a well-paying post. The pleasure-loving Constanze resigned herself with the best grace possible to remain behind. The travelers stopped off in Prague, in Dresden, in Leipzig, where Mozart played the organ in St. Thomas Church in so masterly a fashion that Bach's erstwhile pupil, the aged cantor Johann Friedrich Doles, believed for a moment that his old master had come back to life and hastened to show his delighted guest one of the Bach motets the church possessed. On April 25 Mozart arrived at the court in Potsdam, where the king gave him 100 Friedrichsdor, ordered 6 string quartets and some easy clavier sonatas for his daughter, but did nothing about a Kapellmeister position or a commission for an opera. Mozart did go to the theater in Berlin, where he heard his own Entführung, was applauded by the audience, and audibly scolded a blundering violinist in the orchestra. But his fortunes had not materially changed, and in May he was writing to Constanze, "My dear little wife, you will have to get more satisfaction from my return than from any money I am bringing." When he reached home and found her suffering from a foot trouble, he sent her, regardless of his depleted purse, to nearby Baden for a cure, at the same time admonishing her to beware of flirtations. Then he set to work on the quartets for the Prussian king, of which he finished 3, the last he was to write, and a single easy sonata, instead of the promised 6, for the Princess Frederica. In September 1789 he was to compose for his friend, the clarinet virtuoso Anton Stadler, the Celestial Clarinet Quintet, K. 581, which for sheer euphony is almost without parallel in its composer's writings. The success of a revival of Figaro in August 1789 appears to have moved the emperor to approach Mozart with a commission for a new opera. The outcome was Così fan tutti, the incentive to the plot being an incident said to have taken place in Viennese society. Once again Lorenzo da Ponte was called upon to put the piece into shape. The fundamentals of the story are to be found in Boccaccio, and it may well have been in the Decameron that da Ponte discovered the real basis of his dexterous and amusing, though highly artificial, comedy. We know little about the circumstances surrounding the composition of the piece. On January 21, 1790, Così fan tutti was performed at the Burgtheater. The reviews, if middling, were not outright unfavorable. "The music of Mozart is charming, the plot amusing enough," wrote Count Zinzendorf in his diary, and the Journal des Luxus und der Moden remarked, "It is sufficient to say of the music that it was composed by Mozart." Until the following autumn the work achieved only 10 performances. It is not unreasonable to explain this by the fact that in 1790 Joseph II, who for some time had been ailing, died and was succeeded by a ruler of very different tendencies, his brother Leopold II. Later works. With the accession of the new emperor, Mozart briefly imagined the gates of his good luck were about to open. He was quickly disillusioned. Leopold II was hard, cold, unmusical. He instantly dismissed some of his predecessor's most faithful artistic servitors. Da Ponte, for one, was dropped. Mozart's opponent, Salieri, cautiously withdrew into obscurity and waited behind the scenes for a new opportunity. Van Swieten tried to obtain for Mozart a position as teacher of the Archduke Franz, but nothing came of the well-meant effort, and presently the composer found his pupils reduced to two. His health began to trouble him alarmingly, with headaches and tooth troubles. He had the mortification of being ignored when the King of Naples visited Vienna, while Salieri and Haydn enjoyed special honors. He was not even asked to participate in the musical festivities in connection with the emperor's coronation in October 1790, or to travel to Frankfurt, where the ceremony was to take place. So he decided to make the journey at his own expense, hoping against hope for some distinction or reward. Though he did not obtain either, he at least had the satisfaction of knowing that his Don Giovanni, Figaro, Führung, and even the early Finta Giardiniera were relished in neighboring Mainz. The opera chosen for the actual coronation was Rachnitsky's Oberon. However, the Frankfurt Town Council graciously allowed Mozart to give a concert on his own responsibility at a local theater, October 13, at 11 in the morning. "Plenty of honor, but little money," he wrote. He played two concertos, probably the F major, K. 459, and the D major, K. 537, and a rondo. As ever, his improvisation impressed deeply. Only a royal luncheon party and a maneuver of Hessian troops were counter-attractions that cut down the attendance. On the way home he stopped off in Mannheim and Munich, saw his old friends Cannabich and Ramm, played at an academy the Elector Karl Theodor gave for the returning King of Naples, and went home to Vienna, where Constanze had moved their effects into a new apartment in the Rauhensteingasse, destined to be his last home on earth. In his new dwelling the composer completed by December two superb works, the String Quintet in D, K. 593, and the stunning Adagio and Allegro in F minor, K. 594, for an organ cylinder in a clock. About that same time the director of the Italian Opera in London, one O'Reilly, suggested that he come for half a year to England to write two operas for that theatre and give concerts, and promised him £300 sterling. Nothing stood in the way of O'Reilly's suggestion except operas that the master was soon to provide for Vienna and Prague. Soon afterwards Haydn, on his way to London, took leave of his younger friend, who bade him farewell with the heart-shaking words, "I fear, Papa, this is the last time we shall see each other." Salomon, Haydn's manager, had planned to bring Mozart to England on the older composer's return to the Continent. To be sure, there was other work to be done, if, in large part, trifling. But early in January 1791 Mozart completed his last clavier concerto, the singularly affecting one in B flat, K. 595, which harks back to earlier models and lacks some of the more original and dramatic elements of the incomparable ones in D minor, E flat, A major, C major, and C minor. And in June 1791, on a visit to Constanze in Baden, where she had gone for another cure, he wrote for a local choirmaster, Anton Stoll, that short Ave Verum motet, than which nothing of Mozart's is more unutterably seraphic. End of Part 4. Part 5. The Magic Flute. Mozart was ill and despondent, but his activity was untiring. It is an infinite pity that he did not take the hint of Da Ponte and others who were urging him to come to England, where he might easily have made a fortune and become a British idol like Handel before him and Haydn and Mendelssohn after him. He went on writing because, as he was soon to say, composition tires me less than resting. In the spring of 1791 he was commissioned to compose another opera, which was to be his last and, in a number of respects, his most epoch-making, The Magic Flute, Die Zauberflöte, and with it he was to write one of the most extraordinary works of operatic history, to create German opera in accordance with a long-cherished ambition of his, but, like Moses, never to do more than cross the frontier of the promised land he had beheld in vision. Emanuel Schikaneder, who had known Wolfgang and Leopold Mozart in Salzburg, was a wandering actor and a playwright of sorts, the head of a traveling company which gave Shakespeare, Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, and, for better or worse, operas by Gluck and Singspiele by Haydn and Mozart. He had, like numerous barnstormers, a keen knowledge of the taste of audiences, particularly of the plebeian ones to which his players catered. In his own way, as adventurous a person as Da Ponte, Schikaneder took over in 1789 the direction of a playhouse on the Starnberg estates, the Freihaustheater, in the Wieden district. There he produced comic shows, Singspiele, and operettas. With his grasp of suburban tastes he combined a thorough understanding of what could be done with his brother Mason and old acquaintance Mozart. A business rival of the impresario Marinelli, who ran a theater in the Leopoldstadt quarter and made a specialty of magic plays, he now approached the composer with his own Singspiel. We cannot here examine the sources from which he assembled his libretto. There ran through it a powerful strain of Masonic influence, love interest, low comedy in abundance (Schikaneder took care to tailor to his own measure the role of the wandering bird-catcher Papageno), and other sure-fire theatrical ingredients. He asked Mozart to supply the music, and the latter, after warning him that since he had never yet written a magic opera, he hesitated to court failure in this sphere, at length complied. Between March and the end of September 1791 the Magic Flute was written. Schikaneder, aware of the glorious bargain he had struck, strove to be the soul of complaisance. He supplied the composer with every comfort at his disposal: a charming summer house on the grounds of the theater where he could work at the score, with food, wine, and pretty actresses to divert him; in short, whatever promised to humor the musician and promote the flow of inspiration. He even hummed or sang the sort of tunes he considered appropriate to the role he designed for himself. Let us at this stage dispose of a few legends that in the course of 160 years have accumulated about the work. One is that the play is a farrago of childish nonsense, made tolerable only by the variety and grandeur of Mozart's music. Another, that the plot was altered at a late hour because another manager was about to produce a work similar in its story. A third, that the piece was a failure. As a matter of fact, the book of the Magic Flute happens to be one of the best librettos in existence from the point of view of good theater. The imagined revision never took place, for considerations of parallels, let alone plagiarisms, never bothered theater directors at this epoch. On the contrary, if a play or opera had one feature that pleased its public, a rival manager was quick to copy this very point on an even broader scale. Although at the first performance the Magic Flute did not achieve such an overwhelming triumph as its composer had hoped, before many months had passed it was attracting throngs, and not many years later Schikaneder was able to build out of the wealth it brought him that famous Theater an der Wien, which still stands and was to become the cradle of various storied masterworks. As for the much-maligned book, it appealed so powerfully to none other than Goethe that he set out to write a sequel. While the sick and harried Mozart worked with still inexhaustible fertility at the score of his magic opera, he was interrupted by a sufficiently distasteful order from Prague for an opera to be produced there at the coronation of Leopold II as King of Bohemia. With no more than 18 days to compose the music and assist in the production of this occasional piece, he was ordered to set an old text of Metastasio's, retouched, it is true, by one Caterino Mazzola, La Clemenza di Tito, an antiquated specimen of opera seria, such as the composer had not bothered with since the period of Idomeneo. The available time being so short, Mozart took along with him his pupil Süssmayr, who was asked to perform the almost secretarial job of writing the secco recitatives, leaving the more important parts of the music to the master. His good friend, the impresario Guardasoni, mounted the opera in sumptuous fashion, but goodwill did not supplant genuine inspiration, and for all its craftsmanship La Clemenza di Tito did not strike fire. The Empress dismissed it as porcheria tedesca, German rubbish. A correspondent of Studien für Tonkünstler und Musikfreunde reported that the beloved Kapellmeister Mozart did not obtain this time the applause he had a right to expect. For once, clearly, his Praguers did not understand him. Doubtless Tito is not a Figaro or a Don Giovanni, but those unfamiliar with the work may well ask themselves if it is as bad as history paints it. Anyway, its reception did not raise the master's spirit, and he took leave of his friends with tears. He was now seriously ill. He had fainting fits and accesses of exhaustion. On September 28, 1791, he finished the Magic Flute, the March of the Priests and the Overture being the last numbers set down. The Masonic symbols and meanings with which the opera is filled, comprehensible, however, only to initiates, are heard in the thrice reiterated three chords at the opening of the superb tone piece. The overture is a fully developed sonata movement built on a fugal plan, the mercurial subject having been borrowed from a clavier sonata of his old friend and rival Clementi. At the first performance the composer Johann Schenk, later one of Beethoven's teachers, crept through the orchestra to Mozart, who was conducting, and reverently kissed his hand, while the composer, continuing to conduct with his right hand, affectionately patted Schenk's head with his left. He took pleasure in playing the glockenspiel during Papageno's air Ein Mädchen oder Weibchen, and once, in fun, introduced an unexpected arpeggio which threw Schikaneder completely out for a few minutes. The Requiem. As he was boarding his coach on the trip to Prague, Mozart was startled on being accosted by a gaunt, gray-clad stranger of mysterious mien, who asked him if he were willing to undertake, for a certain sum, the composition of a Requiem Mass to be delivered at a specified time. He agreed, but from this moment the weird visitor, whose identity he was admonished not to try to discover, gave him no rest. He became convinced that a messenger from the beyond had sought him out, that the incident had a supernatural aspect, that he was indeed ordered by a higher power to compose a death mass for himself. And the certainty that his time was at hand grew steadily upon him. The incident, in reality, had nothing macabre or mysterious about it. The Grey Messenger was a certain Leutgeb, steward of the Count Walsegg zu Stupak, who had lately lost his wife, and who, aspiring to be known as a composer, planned to perform the Requiem as his own work. But Mozart knew nothing of this. He had a letter from his old friend Da Ponte, entreating him to join him in England, but it was too late, and Mozart's tragedy had to be played out to the bitter close that was now swiftly approaching. To Da Ponte he dispatched this pathetic missive: "I wish I could follow your advice, but how can I do so? I feel stunned, I reason with difficulty, and cannot rid myself of the vision of this unknown man. I see him perpetually. He entreats me, he presses me, he impatiently demands the work. I go on writing. Otherwise I have nothing more to fear. I know from what I suffer that the hour is come. I am at the point of death. I have come to the end before having had the enjoyment of my talent. Life was so beautiful, my career stood at first under so auspicious a star, but one cannot change one's destiny. What tortured him more than anything was the thought that, as furiously as he worked, the Requiem might remain unfinished at the death he knew was imminent. He had numberless discussions with his pupil, Xaver Süssmayr, but it was daily becoming clearer to him that he had small chance of completing the Mass himself. On a walk in the Prater with Constanze in the early autumn, he exclaimed, "It cannot last much longer. Certainly I have been given poison. That is a feeling I cannot shake off." And this, presumably, is the basis of the age-old slander that Salieri had been his murderer. At all events, growing weakness forced him to take to his bed on November 20. He was never to leave it. "I know," he had said shortly before, "that my music-making is about at an end. I feel a constant chill which I cannot explain. I now have no more to do save with doctors and apothecaries." His hands and feet were beginning to swell, yet he struggled desperately to get on with the composition of the Mass. The visits of a few friends seemed to comfort the sick man, and he asked them to try over in his presence certain completed pages of the score. At the beginning of December he himself struggled to sing some of the alto part of the work. When the Lacrimosa was reached he gave up the attempt after a few measures, and overcome by the certainty that he was doomed never to finish the music, he broke down in a fit of weeping. And in these days, with tragic irony, there dawned a promise of better things. The rapidly growing popularity of the magic flute augured a carefree future. A group of Hungarian nobles began to raise a subscription that would have assured Mozart an annual income of 1,000 gulden, and from Holland there came, almost at the 12th hour, news of an even more gratifying project. Mozart's death. In the last hours his sister-in-law, Sophie Havel, lent what assistance she could. Constanze, grief-stricken and stupefied, was helpless. The sick man, tortured to the last by the thought of his unfinished Requiem, was shaken by the chills and fires of fever. It was found necessary to take a canary out of the sick-room because the singing of the bird seemed to cause the sufferer physical pain. He appealed to Sophie to remain with him, to comfort Constanze, and to see me die. I have the taste of death on my tongue already, and who is to care for my Constanze when I am gone? A doctor who attended him was at the theater when summoned and, realizing the hopelessness of the case, promised to come when the play was over. Sophie was dispatched to call a priest. When she returned she found the dying man bending over some sketches of the Requiem and giving Süssmayr some final directions about the work. At last he lapsed into unconsciousness a few moments before the end, puffing out his cheeks and making what the tearful bystanders imagined to be an effort to imitate the sound of the drums in his unfinished score. And 5 minutes before 1 on the morning of December 5, 1791, he died. Of what illness did Mozart die? Typhus, some say. A result of childhood illness, say others, complicated by the strain of overwork, traveling, disappointments, and deprivations. The most plausible medical explanation would appear to have been supplied by a modern Salzburg physician, Dr. H. Kasseroller, who diagnosed the cause of the master's early demise as uremia resulting from Bright's disease. And this may explain the composer's persistent idea in his last weeks that he had been administered poison. The rest of the pitiful story need not detain us. The parsimonious Baron von Swieten advised Constanze to observe economy in making the funeral arrangements, and so Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave. On December 6 the body was taken to the cemetery of St. Mark's. A handful of mourners who followed the hearse dispersed when a heavy snowstorm made progress difficult. The stricken Constanze found it impossible to accompany the pathetic little cortege, and when some time later she attempted to discover her husband's resting place, a new gravedigger who replaced the earlier one had no idea whatever where he lay. What matter that posterity has never discovered the whereabouts of his sepulchre? Mozart, the incessant wanderer, the infinitely lonely, now lives more fully and gloriously than ever in the hearts and souls of all true worshippers of the divinest in music. And if his earthly tragedy has never seemed so poignant as it does today, we can take consolation from the circumstance that our generation has learned to prize the greatness, elevation, and beauty of his art more perhaps than did any of our predecessors. End of Part 5. End of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart by Herbert Peyser.